there's a lot of information. It's a kind of global picture in some ways, and then gets down to some specifics. I've kind of outlined here some of the main themes, but don't try and, what I think I want to just listen. Don't try and write all this stuff down. I really want to convey some sort of major themes, though at times there may seem like quite a lot of specific information. It's an impossibly big subject for one talk, but I think it's really important, as Elizabeth in her wonderful lecture on Monday did, talking about Jewish culture. We can't think about early modern Christianity or early modern world without, of course, Islam. Islam, we talked about the Jesuits in the missions, and that is really the beginning of a kind of global Christianity, but it's really an embryonic form of early Christianity, or of global religion. Islam, in contrast, truly is a global religion by the 16th century. It extends from Southeast Asia, Indonesia is a region we might think of today, right through to the opening through Spain and North Africa, down through Egypt, up to the Balkans, sort of modern-day Serbia, Croatia, and into Hungary. So by the 16th century, it's actually pressing at the gates of Vienna, so in modern-day Austria. It dominates in the Indian Ocean. So it really is a global religion in this period. And its history is very distinctive, but also, and this is something I want to stress, many of its mentalities, given the nature of the Islamic empires, its nature is distinctive in many ways from Christianity. One of the things I want to talk about later on is that for Christianity there is this enormous fear of Islam. That Islam, in various ways, is seen in apocalyptic terms. This is the end battle. This is God's punishment on Christianity. There is this fear that Christian Europe is going to be overrun by Islam. But what I want to suggest today, that in many ways the mentalities of the Islamic empires are really quite different than they were imagined to be. Because what we have in the 16th and 17th century is in some ways a massive growth of knowledge of Islam and of Islamic empires, but also a very limited knowledge. So it's both at the same time, that there's a kind of failure to understand the complexities of Islam. And one way of thinking about that is the Quran itself. What you get in the 16th century, really for the first time, is Christians, particularly Christian scholars, are looking at the Quran seriously. But they have this perspective on the Quran that they think that it is the whole of Islam. So there's a tendency to reduce the whole of Islam to this one text. So we're thinking about conflicting mentalities and perceptions in here. But I think it's also a theme I want to stress, is that our discussion this week, you're looking at Locke's letter on toleration, which really speaks to what we want to get at today, and that is, in the early modern world, how is difference? How do they deal with difference? Elizabeth talked about Jews on Monday and Christian attitudes towards Judaism, but also Jewish attitudes towards Christianity. And in many ways, it's something of an internal relationship. Islam, of course, for the most part, exists on the borders. It's an other in that sense. But it raises questions of what sort of relationship is there with the other in this period. And Locke, of course, is dealing with this within Christianity, as Elizabeth talked about on Monday. How do you have religion that has been fragmented into different forms, how do you exist alongside each other? Because you need to. But what do you imagine toleration to be? What do you imagine that relationship with others can possibly be? Locke has a particular perspective on this, that it includes some but not others. What I want to suggest here in talking about Islam, and I'm going to talk mostly about the Ottomans, is that their attitude towards the others actually is deeply influential on the 17th century Locke and others. That Islam, in some ways, shifts from being simply the enemy to being a model for a certain type of inclusive religion. So we see this period of shifting attitudes. But let's just get a sense from some maps of how enormous, what vast amounts of lands are within the Muslim empires. Here you see, running right through to 1700, extending from what is modern-day Yemen and Saudi Arabia, across Egypt, what's modern-day Algeria, right through to Morocco. And then here, up along the border, these, of course, we know that none of these borders are fixed in the sense that we look at them in maps. We talked about that at the beginning of this course. These lines are constantly in flux. So it looks like borders in the modern sense, but please don't think of it those. These areas in Europe and in North Africa and eastward towards Persia are constantly being renegotiated and moving. So this is just a kind of visual conception, but you can see it extends right up through what is modern-day Hungary, Austria, right to the borders of Germany. And that will play an important role in the Reformation, which of course is one of the contemporary events. The Turks, as they are referred to, are major figures in the Reformation, but they have important views about the Reformation, which are significant for the large numbers of Christian lands over which they have control. Sorry, this is not, oh, there we go. At the same time, of course, in India, what was a somewhat debated term, Hindustan, becomes the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. In between, I'm not sure if I have a map, I don't think I have a map of, but we have the Safavid Empire, which is modern-day Iran, extending through Iraq. So it's moving right across here, here we see the expansion of Islam in what is modern day, for the most part, Indonesia. So this vast extension, just to come back, I'll come back to this point in a few moments. I'm sorry, the clicker's not working very well. But it also crucial to this story is the Indian Ocean, which is sometimes was referred to as this Islamic lake in the early modern period, because it extends from India right through to east coast of Africa, up through Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf. This vast network of trade, but not only of trade, but of cultural exchange. So that we mustn't think of these Muslim empires as in any way homogeneous, but extraordinarily dynamic and diverse bodies that which include not only Muslims, but a whole range of other religions, including Christianity. And as Elizabeth told us on Monday, many of the Jews who leave the Iberian Peninsula are welcomed into the Ottoman Empire, where they become a crucial part of commerce, but also of culture. And they're received in ways, of course, which they are rejected in Christian Europe. So that's something we want to talk about. I think it's better if I stand over here. But let's start back where we spoke a little some weeks ago with Spain. Because the story of Al-Andalus, the last remaining Muslim emirate in Europe, southern Spain, because it plays an enormous role in the kind of Muslim, Islamic historical memory. The conquest of Granada, which is the last holdout of the, as you can see, of the Nasrid dynasty in Spain, took place as Spain was becoming unified, the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, Castile and Aragon coming together, this notion of a kind of Catholic Spain that we've talked about, both in relationship to the Americas, but also in relationship to this idea, we talked about Teresa of Avila, this notion of a Spanish Catholicism that emerges, which is in many ways a kind of notion of Spanish being a sort of pure blood. With the fall of Al-Andalus, the first response of the new Christian rulers was to permit a certain degree of toleration for Muslims who remained. But many of the Muslims, particularly the elites, including the royal family, scholars, leading economic and political figures, leave Spain and go to North Africa. But the way in which this toleration, if we can use that term, or tolerance perhaps better, of Muslims is arranged in return for the payment of tribute. But there is deep suspicion that these Muslims are actually still undermining Spanish rule. And this is what will lead, just to make a longer story quite short, will lead to, by the beginning of the 16th century, to forcible conversions of the Muslims to Christianity, forced baptism. That leads to a revolt, which in some ways is quite successful. But that revolt is crushed and begins the period of the early 16th century in which the group which are called Moriscos, who are forced converts to Christianity. Now this is slightly in contrast to the situation with the Jews that we've heard about, who are expelled in the 1490s and 1492. So at first, there is a degree of tolerance for the Muslims, but by the beginning of the 16th century, they're given the option of either converting or of exile, or sometimes also the notion of death. The rate of conversion is often quite slow, building this culture of suspicion. And what we know is that many of these Moriscos, which means little Moors, that this term that's used for them, are practicing a kind of hybrid religion, still practicing many aspects of Islam while outwardly conforming to Christianity. This term, Moriscos, is actually of a later use, but it is this idea of a kind of inferior form of Christianity, that they are not the old Christians who are the Spanish Christians, but they are given the term new Christians, with a distinction between the two. The exodus from Spain is of enormous influence in that there is a diaspora across the Mediterranean, including, as I said earlier, into the Ottoman Empire. There is a lot of close connection between those Muslims who leave Spain and Jewish communities. So as kind of diaspora communities, there is actually a considerable amount of connection between the two. This is what brings into discussion the Ottoman Empire. And as you can see here, that by the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire has built this body which is multi-ethnic, multilingual. It is an extraordinarily diverse body, and I want to say something about how that reflects the attitudes of the Ottoman rulers. It has expanded exponentially during the late 15th century. We'll talk about this in a moment, the fall of Constantinople, the end of the Byzantine Empire, so Christianity. But it will also expand into Egypt and into the areas that we now know as Saudi Arabia. It becomes the ruler of the major cities of Islam, Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, the holy cities. It becomes acquires this identity of being this sacred Islamic state. But within it, there is enormous diversity. And that diversity, it reflects the ways in which the Ottoman extended their rule. When they did so, they did not work by, as we saw in Spain, a principle of forced conversions. In fact, they were quite content to allow religious groups, notably Christians and Jews, to retain their own faith, as in return they had to pay a tribute. The Ottoman officials would go into communities and learn as much as they possibly could about the inner dynamics and beliefs and cultures of those communities. They were extraordinarily well informed. And their goal was not to suppress these communities, but in a sense to work with them by recruiting the elites, the learned, into a relationship with the Ottoman rulers. And one of the key ways in which they do this was a system by which they would recruit soldiers, famously one known as the Janissaries. Oops, I didn't mean to. Maybe need a new battery. But they have what's called the Dimashirmi system, in which, in return for tribute, local rights were retained. But alongside this, they recruited, not only for the military, but for administrative training, what is often referred to as slave soldiers, but figures who would actually be brought into the Ottoman army and brought into Ottoman administration, many of them who were both Christians and Jews. They were taken from these areas, and in return, they were educated and trained and held high office, so that you have this unique situation within the Ottoman Empire of an extraordinarily diverse body of people who are serving the state. This served the Ottomans in very effective ways because it allowed them to have relationships with different local communities and groups and regions. So this flexibility of empire serves them extremely well. So not trying to force conversion, not trying to force themselves on these peoples, but actually in some ways recruiting them and bringing them into a relationship. And that's what creates unusual circumstances. We have this idea sometimes that it's kind of Islam on the one side and Christianity on the other. That's absolutely not the case. The Ottoman Empire contained large numbers of both Christians and Jews, many of whom who were working within the state. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this is the fall of Byzantium in 1453 with the capture of Constantinople. That army of Mehmed at Constantinople actually had also Christian vassals and Christian soldiers. So again, it's not simply a battle between Islam and Christianity as often is portrayed. It's much more complicated than that because the nature of the Ottoman Empire is itself much more complicated. I've got, as ever, sort of more information on here than we can have time to talk about. But here you see the expansion of the Ottoman through Anatolia, which is, of course, modern-day Turkey, right through to where Constantinople was. But you see it's extending beyond this, well up into the Balkans and into Europe. And in these areas of the Balkans are Christian princes who become vassals of the Ottomans, and that is, they are allowed to retain their authority and rule as long as they are in a relationship of vassalage to the Ottoman rulers and pay tribute. And their soldiers will often fight in Ottoman armies. So it's a complex notion of empire, which is different than we might be imagining. For instance, if we think about the Holy Roman Empire in Europe. Other ways in which the Ottoman Empire is so successful at expanding this way is that it was extraordinarily open as it moved into other areas of acquiring new knowledge about administration of the state, taxation systems, military knowledge, and perhaps notably artillery, because it's artillery that ultimately brings down the walls of Constantinople. But this incredible thirst for knowledge and the way in which they will appropriate knowledge often from people that they conquer and bring it in and adapt it to their own system. And this happens in a variety of ways. I'm going to... Perhaps the most dramatic way is in Egypt, which has the great Mamluk culture, which was a very sophisticated cultural state, modern-day Egypt, but extending south along the Nile. The Ottomans at the beginning of the 16th century conquer Egypt, the Mamluk dynasty, but in so doing, adopt many aspects of that culture. They appropriate them into themselves and constantly reforming themselves on the basis of acquiring new knowledge. And that extends to virtually all aspects. It extends to language, notably Arabic traditions of literature, science, technology. So with the conquest of Egypt, the Ottoman Empire now extends south into what is now Saudi Arabia. It becomes truly a Mediterranean empire. They also inherit distinctive Islamic traditions. So there is this idea that it's constantly evolving. And it's during this period that the Ottomans become now a world power, a serious rival to divided Christianity, but within itself also not wholly uniform, because as we saw that it extends from the Mediterranean across to Southeast Asia, but there are different forms of it. Namely, as we're familiar today with the Sunni and the Shia. A long and fascinating story that goes back to Muhammad himself and who is to be the successor of Muhammad. Is it to be someone from the family, what emerges as the Shia say, or is it to be someone who is elected by the elders? And that causes an early split, which remains to this day, but the vast majority being Sunni, but we've seen in modern times the complexities of that in Iraq. But this becomes highly significant because it's in the 16th century, because for most of what we would call the medieval period, the Sunni and the Shia lived in relative peace, holding to most of the same religious or theological principles. But it is in the period that we see now that there starts to become a significant difference. But just to return to this other point, one of the major ways in which we see how the Ottomans saw themselves and how they saw the Christian world is that with following the fall of Byzantium and Constantinople in 1453, Emperor Mehmed did not see this as a break in history, but rather a new era in which he became the emperor, that he succeeded the Christian emperors of Byzantium from Constantine onwards, that he inherited the tradition of Rome and Christianity. So that there's this notion of continuity rather than simply breaking it and replacing it with Islam. That's not how they saw themselves at all, but rather as the natural successors. And so we see within Byzantium that Mehmed and his successors are highly inclined to preserve Christian and Jewish culture, to embrace it within a much more diverse body. So the Ottomans see themselves as the natural successors of Rome, of the classical world, but also of Christianity. So I've talked about this. This time is going to make it short. But what we see here is that this enormous Ottoman Empire, which is bordered in the east by Iran or Persia, where the Shia, and to this day, are the predominant group. So there is very tense relations between the Ottoman and the Safavid Empire, which is Persia, so that the Ottomans then see themselves as standing in this central place between Christian Europe on one side and the Shia Persian Empire on the other. But within that, despite those differences, develops during the period that we're looking at complex or transnational links of trade, of culture, of languages, and of religion. And the Ottomans are in many ways at the center of this transition of knowledge and culture. And they see themselves very much in that role. The constant movement of scholars, of merchants, of political rulers, and of other communities. So it's an extraordinarily dynamic age. The Safavid Empire, I don't really have much time to go into this, except that it is this rivalry with the Ottoman, but at the same time, there is considerable amount of interaction between the two. So this is a complex relationship that is marked both by rivalry, sometimes military action, but also in many shared principles. Religion is, of course, absolutely integral to this. The Ottoman rulers saw themselves as sacred. The Sultan was a sacred figure. So there's no separation of religion from the state or from the empire. It is embodied in the figure of the Sultan. And that's why you get this in the 16th century. The Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, refers to Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire, only as the King of Germany, not as an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, because the Sultan says, or the Ottoman believed that had passed to them, so that the Holy Roman Emperor was no longer the head of Christianity. That had passed to Constantinople. Annoying. Now, where is this gone? I don't know why it's doing this. Let's see if it will work. Yeah, I don't know. This is just not working very well. So I want to, because time is tight, but I want to give this sense of the Islamic world extending in extraordinary diversity from the Mediterranean through modern-day India, not only to Southeast Asia, but during this period is building very close links with China. And there comes increasing Muslim population in China. And that is particularly evident in the south, in the region of the Indian Ocean, where the Chinese are increasingly eager to become involved in what is the extraordinarily rich trade culture. It is that trade culture that in many ways feeds the extraordinary wealth of the Muslim empires, in particular of the Ottoman. And it is through Venice in the West that which becomes a kind of meeting point between East and West, as it already is in the medieval period, that there is this increasing amount of trade between the Ottomans and Europe. We have this idea that the Ottomans were simply the enemies of Christian Europe, but we have to remember that during this period there's an extraordinary amount of cultural and commercial exchange. The movement of technology, the movement of cultural texts, as I'll talk about in a few moments. I've spoken about the Indian Ocean. I want to move on here, but here you just have an image of the extraordinary trade routes that existed through this, where the Mughal Muslim Empire sits in the center of this, but it's now become possible to go up through the Red Sea to Cairo, up the Persian Gulf towards Baghdad, through Persia, India, Southeast Asia, and as I mentioned before, up into China. The Indian Ocean, we think of it because of our particular perspective, this focus on the Mediterranean world and then later on the transatlantic world. But the Indian Ocean is perhaps the greatest center of commerce in this period, generating enormous wealth and cultural exchange. So I want to say something, time is always too short, but I want to say something about perceptions here in the last 10 minutes or so. Christian perceptions of Islam are very much shaped in the Middle Ages. And one text, which is perhaps the most influential of all, is one that's written by a Dominican monk, which sets the tone in the 13th and 14th centuries, which sets the tone that Islam is actually a Christian heresy. It creates this tradition that Islam is actually a deviant form of Christianity, which falsely identifies Jesus as a prophet and not as the Son of God, so that it refuses or fails to see in Christ his divinity. Rather, it focuses on his humanity, so that Islam becomes associated with the Christian heresy of Nestorianism, a false view of the two natures of Christ. That becomes at the center of this perception of what Islam is. But there are other views. The Quran, of which there is very little knowledge in the medieval period, but during the 16th century, much greater access to this. But there is this idea that the Quran represents a kind of irrational religion, that it is difficult to follow, that it's confusing, that it's inchoate. There's this constant comparison between the Bible and the Quran to demonstrate that the stories of the Bible, particularly with their focus on God's salvation history, is a clear revelation of the divine, whereas the Quran is simply a bundle of confusing and often contradictory stories. There is this view that Islam is idolatrous. It is a view that Islam is that it worships multiple gods. These are the views that the early modern world inherits and largely accepts uncritically. But the Christian view is also shaped by the sort of existential Islamic threat. The idea, the belief that the Islamic armies, which are expanding through the Balkans into Hungary, so very much moving towards Central Europe, are actually going to overrun the whole of Christian Europe. And as I mentioned before, this is often portrayed in apocalyptic terms. It's like Cyrus in the Hebrew Bible, this instrument of God punishing the Christianity that has departed from the truth. So you can imagine how both Catholics and Protestants are using this story to in polemical ways to demonstrate that it is a punishment for the heresies of the other. But this expansion into Eastern Europe is really, from the Ottoman point of view, not entirely what the Christians thought it was. The Ottomans, we know now, had no intention of trying to overrun the whole of Christian Europe. They expanded in the East so that they could create more of these vassalage states from which they could draw resources in return for permitting these areas to retain their own religion and customs. But they had no intention of simply conquering Europe. So there's this sort of disconnect between the way in which the two sides perceived each other. The dominant figure of the 16th century, of course, is Suleiman the Magnificent. And here, what's interesting is a portrait of him painted by one of the great artists in the West, Titian. And in terms of iconography, one of the things that's interesting here is the way in which Suleiman is portrayed with a turban. And in European art of the 16th and 17th century, Ottomans, or Turks as they were often referred to, are always portrayed wearing turbans. It becomes a kind of iconic representation of Islam and of Ottoman characters. Here you see just the extent of the advance into Europe. What role do the Ottomans play in the Reformation? It's an absolutely crucial one. The expansion in the East causes, as I've mentioned before, this panic that Christendom is at risk, that it is about to be overrun. Now, this is happening during the 1520s, just as the Reformation story is unfolding. The siege of Vienna, well, first of all, to mention, there is this great defeat of Christian Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, which was a huge catastrophe. The Hungarian king is killed. There is the siege of Vienna in 1529, so they've moved so far down the Danube River to Vienna. The siege is ultimately not successful, but it forces the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V to have to put aside his attempts to crush the Reformation because he needs the Protestant princes to provide military sources to defend against the Turks in the East. And why is that important for the Reformation? Because that temporary alliance between the Catholic monarch and the Protestant princes creates space for Protestantism to expand and grow. It creates an extended period of time in which the Catholic forces are not able to move against Protestantism. And it's in those crucial years of the 1520s and 1530s that Protestantism gets a hold of large parts, particularly of Central Europe. But it also plays an important role because Europe, as we've talked about on many occasions, is not one thing. So that you also get the kings of France, who are the bitter enemies of the German emperor, actually making alliances with the Ottomans against their enemies. So the story there is much more complicated. France creates an alliance with the Ottomans as a way of putting pressure on the German Empire. So that the role, I've already, this is just, I have here the Confutatio al-Qurani by Montecroce. This is the text from 1300, so the 13th into the 14th century. This is the text that is so influential in shaping Christian attitudes towards the Quran and Islam. I want to just, in the last few minutes, to talk about particularly the Quran and its transformative role in the 16th century. Printing is one of the cultures from the West that makes its way into the East and transforms Ottoman culture through the ability to disseminate printed texts. But there is also, and going back to our story with Erasmus and the early reformers with their belief that you have to get to the original languages, there is also this belief that Arabic is a crucial language to learn as a way of understanding the Bible. Remember, Elizabeth showed us this picture of the Walton polyglot from the 17th century, which has Arabic in it. Arabic acquires a new status in the 16th century. Very few people in the West can read it, but it acquires a kind of status almost as a sacred language. So there is this great rush to learn Arabic. And it's seen by Christians that the best way to do this is through the Quran. The Christian imagination of Islam is almost entirely focused, particularly in terms of religion, on the Quran. So in the 16th century, there is an attempt to try to learn as much as possible about the Quran, not to accept, but as a way to be able to refute what they continue to see as the heresy of Islam. And in 1543, you get the first printing of a Latin translation of the Quran, which now makes the text widely available. They don't accept the Quran. I mean, they see the Quran as this dangerous text, and there's a lot of debate about what happens when you make this text available to a public. But the Quran occupies this crucial state because for most Christians, the Islam is the Quran. So this, as I talked about at the beginning, there is this limited body of knowledge, but it's expanding exponentially. The study of Arabic is very closely related to what Elizabeth talked about on Monday, the study of Hebrew. This new intense interest in Semitic languages. And you have, by the end of the 16th century and into the early 17th century, the first chairs of Arabic being established in Western universities. So Arabic and Islam and growing cultural connections with the Ottoman is absolutely part of this culture that we've talked about when we spoke about Galileo, when we spoke about a whole range of different things, when I said that the early modern world is one that's constantly in transition with new knowledge coming in. But what I wanted to suggest in this talk is that it's flowing both ways. But what I've also wanted to suggest that in this week where we're talking about dealing with difference, as Elizabeth talked about on Monday, in the Christian West, there is much more the disposition to vilify the other, whether we talk about witchcraft, if we talk about Jews, if we talk about Islam. From the other side, if we pay more attention to this, we see in the Ottoman Empire a very different attitude. Not one that we would call modern-day liberalism or toleration, but a very different model of way of dealing with difference. It could be suppressive, it could be brutal, but nevertheless, it lays the foundations for what will happen later in Europe in 17th and into the 18th century, that this knowledge of Islam as a much broader tent becomes to influence people like Locke and others who have starting to formulate ideas of toleration and what it can mean for different religions or for different groups within Christianity to exist alongside one another. This is a very slow and long-term process, but connections between the Islamic world and Christianity, and the Islamic world increasingly seen as something of a model for what Christianity could be, is one of the transformative aspects of this period.